Have you ever wondered what the world sounds like right before it changes forever? Not with a loud crash, but with a quiet whisper. Tonight, we're going to travel back in time. We're going to a world of stone villages and silent nights, just before a great shadow fell across it. This is the story of the Black Death. But this isn't a history lesson filled with dates and figures. This is a story told quietly for the end of the day. In this video, we will journey through the entire story, part by part, from the peaceful beginning to the changed world left behind. We will discover how even in the darkest of times, small lights of kindness and hope can still be found. Before we begin our journey into the past, if you enjoy this kind of atmospheric storytelling, please take a moment to press the like button below. It's a small click, but it truly helps our channel reach more people who love stories like this. And if you'd like to join us for future journeys, please subscribe and click the notification bell so you won't miss what comes next. I would also love to hear from you. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. It's always wonderful to see where our stories are traveling. Thank you. And now, find a comfortable place. Let the world outside fade away. Let's begin. Imagine a very quiet night, a long time ago. The sky was clear and full of sparkling stars. Cool air moved slowly through the small cracks in the old wooden windows. A soft, gray mist hung low over the fields, covering the world like a blanket. The only sound was a light breeze rustling the dry leaves and grass. Far away, a wolf howled. Its call was lonely and sad, like a bad dream waiting to begin. This was Europe in the mid-1300s. The year was 1345. The world seemed very peaceful. No one guessed that nights like this would soon be over. In a small French village, life moved slowly. People woke up with the sun and worked in the fields all day. They returned to their simple stone houses at night. For dinner, they ate warm vegetable soup. They sat together on wooden benches before going to sleep early. Church bells helped them mark the time. Their prayers gave them comfort in the dark. Their hopes were always simple. They hoped for a good harvest and for their children to stay healthy. On a night like this, a farmer closed the door to his house. His wife put out the fire in the hearth, while their children slept under thin wool blankets. The wind shook the tree branches outside. A cat sat on the roof tiles, watching the moon. This night seemed just like any other, but history was already starting to move, without any sound or any signs. Far away to the east, something was happening. Along the old trade roads, caravans were moving. They carried cloth, spices, and valuable metals. They did not know they also carried something else. Hidden inside their cargo, a small rat climbed aboard. A tiny flea held on tight to the rat's fur. Inside the flea was an unseen sickness. It did not have a name yet, but soon the whole world would know it. The caravans crossed mountains and deserts. They stopped in big trading cities and met other merchants. As goods were traded from one hand to another, the sickness traveled with them. For now, life in Europe had not changed. In cities like Venice, Florence, and London, everything seemed normal. Everyone believed that tomorrow would be the same as today. At the port of Kaffa, sailors prepared their ship to go home. Rats hid on the ship behind sacks of grain. The rats looked ordinary, but they carried a terrible secret on their backs. No one knew what was coming. When death arrives quietly, it does not seem scary at first. It is like the wind, or a shadow, or a leaf falling from a tree. That night, a small child in the village woke from his sleep. He saw moonlight shining through a crack in the window and heard a bird call out. Then he went back to sleep. His mother hugged him tightly to protect him from bad dreams. She did not know that soon, hugs like this would not be enough. Her world was going to change, not because of a war, but because of something quieter, faster, and more deadly. The next morning would still come. People would still go to the fields. Church bells would still ring, and children would still laugh. But behind it all, history was changing. A priest in a town called Bruges wrote his morning prayers. He hoped his people would not get sick with the fever again this year. He did not know that in 2 years, thousands of villages would become silent and empty. Death was walking slowly from the east to the west. It traveled on boats, on wagons, and in the cloaks of merchants. It had no face and no voice, but it would not stop. And that quiet, peaceful night was the night before everything would begin. It was the night before cities would become graves. No one marked this night on a calendar. There were no explosions in the sky or strange sounds. There was only silence. It was a deep silence that would never be the same again. And in that silence, the world was preparing to face a darkness it had never known. The world was connected by dusty roads and slow ships on wide rivers. Traders went from one city to another with goods like silk and spices. People worked in the fields or shaped metal and stone. No one knew that a deadly sickness was moving quietly along these same paths, but it was coming. On the coast of the Black Sea, the port of Kaffa was full of life. Fishermen brought in their nets, and sailors loaded barrels of wine onto ships. Seagulls flew in circles above the harbor, where the ships rocked gently. Below the decks of the ships, rats moved in the shadows, looking for food. Tiny fleas held on tight to their fur. Inside those fleas was a dangerous sickness that had already killed many people in Asia. The traders on the ships did not see it. The captains did not feel it. But the rats carried it with them. One of the ships was ready to leave the port. The wind filled its sails, and the water sparkled in the sun. The sailors laughed and told stories, thinking only of going home. A few weeks later, a trader in the great city of Constantinople began to feel sick with a fever. Pain spread through his body, and the skin under his arms turned black. He tried to keep working, but he was too weak to stand. Soon after, other people fell sick. Doctors believed the air was poisoned and walked the streets with burning herbs, but nothing they did could help. Families locked their doors and prayed. The sound of bells ringing for the dead never stopped. Carts rolled through the streets to carry away the bodies, but the sickness kept spreading. From the docks of the city, other ships hurried to leave. One of these ships traveled to Sicily and landed at the port of Messina. The sailors on this ship were already very weak. Many had died during the long journey. The guards at the port tried to keep the ship away from the land to stop the disease, but it was already too late. A dock worker who touched a crate from the ship felt sick the next day. A child who walked past the ship got a fever. Soon, the streets of Messina were empty, and the churches were filled with quiet prayers. The people waited, but the sickness did not go away. From Sicily, the plague spread to other cities like Genoa and Marseille. In small villages, people died without any warning. Some people blamed the stars, while others thought the wells had been poisoned. Fear was spreading even faster than the disease itself. In some towns, groups of people marched through the streets, whipping themselves and begging for mercy from God. But they could not escape what was coming. But even in the middle of all this fear, some people still showed kindness. A baker in one town left bread on the doorsteps of his sick neighbors. A priest wrote letters to comfort his friends who were far away. A healer wrapped babies who had lost their parents in cloth and sang to them at night. These small, kind acts brought some light into the darkness. By the end of the year 1347, the sickness known as the Black Death had arrived in every southern port in Europe. But this was only the beginning. The sickness would continue to move north into France, Germany, and across the sea to England. It would keep going, moving as fast as the wind. But back in 1346, life in the busy port of Kaffa had continued as normal while the rats were still there, hidden and quiet, carrying the future step by step toward a world that did not yet know its name. The sickness did not arrive with a loud crash like a storm. It came quietly, like fog rising from the ground, and it changed everything. At first, a man would just wake up with a headache and feel strangely warm. He would try to do his work, but his hands would shake, and he would feel very tired. By nighttime, he would be too weak to lift his head. Then, the swelling would begin. A hard spot would appear under the skin, often in the armpit or near the groin. This spot would grow quickly, and the skin around it would turn red, then purple, and then black. It was very painful, and some people said they could feel it throbbing with every beat of their heart. A burning fever would come soon after. The sick would shiver with cold, even as sweat covered their skin. Sometimes they would see things that were not there, or whispered the names of people they knew. In 2 or 3 days, many were gone. Houses they left behind were filled with a deep silence. As fear grew, people who had once shared meals began to cross the road to avoid each other. Some tried to escape by leaving their homes and running to the hills or the woods. But the sickness often followed them, and no matter how far they ran, it always seemed to catch up. The fear became as bad as the sickness itself. People wanted someone to blame, so they pointed fingers at travelers or strangers. The markets fell quiet, and food was left uneaten on counters. The only sound in many towns was the constant ringing of church bells for the dying and the dead. In many places, bodies were no longer buried one by one, but together in large pits dug in the earth. Healers began to appear, wearing long black robes and strange masks. The masks had long curved noses that looked like beaks, and they were filled with sweet-smelling herbs. The doctors used long sticks to check on the sick so they would not have to touch them. But they could not stop the death. They could only watch. People tried to protect themselves in other ways, by carrying bags of herbs or burning incense in their homes, but none of it worked. And yet, even in the middle of this terror, there were still quiet acts of kindness. A father stayed beside his sick daughter even when he started to feel the fever himself. A neighbor left water and bread on a doorstep each day, never asking for thanks. These small acts of love became the light that people followed in the darkness. By the end of the year, thousands were gone, and whole families had been lost. Farms and streets stood empty. The people who were left knew that life had changed forever. A deep silence had settled over the land, and the sickness was still moving forward. At first, the sickness had moved quietly through the southern port towns, but by the winter of 1348, it was no longer a whisper. It was a roar that could bring even the biggest and wealthiest cities to their knees. Venice, the grand city of canals, was one of the first to fall. The waterways grew still, and gondolas floated empty. Palaces that were once filled with music and laughter now stood silent. The city leaders tried to fight back. They kept ships from docking and forced travelers to stay on nearby islands for 40 days, which is where the word quarantine comes from. But the sickness was already inside the city walls, and the rules had come too late. The story was the same in other great cities like Florence and Siena. First came the fever, then the fear. The churches filled with people praying, and then they filled with the sick, and then their doors were closed. Wealthy people tried to escape to their country homes, but the sickness followed them. The plague did not care if you were rich or poor. It came for everyone. The cities began to change. Some people locked themselves in their houses and waited. Others began to act as if nothing mattered anymore. They drank and danced in the streets, saying that if the end was near, they would meet it with laughter. The plague even reached Avignon, the city where the Pope lived. It swept through the holy gardens and monasteries. The Pope's doctors tried to protect him by keeping 2 large fires burning beside him day and night. They believed the heat and smoke would clean the air. The Pope survived, but his city was filled with the dead. In Paris, wise men at the great university debated what caused the sickness, but they could not find a cure. The plague did not listen to their reasons, and the city's busy streets grew cold and empty. Fear of the plague arrived in London before the sickness itself. People whispered stories of what was happening in other lands. Then, in the spring of 1349, the first people in London died. The city fell into chaos. The churchyards filled so quickly that large pits had to be dug outside the city to bury the dead. The bells that used to ring for happy things like weddings now rang only for funerals. But even as the great cities grew quiet, there were still small signs of life. A monk in a monastery wrote down the names of those who had died so they would not be forgotten. A mother told her children stories each night, hoping they would sleep without fear. In a high window, a single candle would burn, not to signal for help, but just to say that someone was still there. The cities had fallen silent, but they were not entirely empty. Hope was still there, even if it was faint. The Black Death had swept through the cities, but its journey was not over yet. Soon, it would find the quiet, open land of the countryside. The great cities had fallen quiet under the sickness, but beyond the city walls, in the small villages and quiet farms, life went on. At first, the people in the countryside believed they would be safe. News from the cities came as stories told by passing travelers, like bad dreams that were happening far away. The fields were still green, and the streams were still clear. The rhythm of the seasons was comforting, and people felt safe in their quiet homes. But the plague had not forgotten these places. It traveled down small roads and forest paths, clinging to the cloth of a traveler or the coin from a market. It arrived quietly. One day, a man returned home from a town market with a cough. Soon, he had a fever, and then his family fell ill. Then, the neighbor who had brought them soup also got sick. Fear spread through the village. Farmers left their fields. Sheep wandered without a shepherd to guide them. The steady, comforting rhythm of country life was shattered. And the small villages, there were no real doctors or hospitals. People tried to use old wisdom, like boiling herbs or placing charms over their doors, but the sickness came all the same. Soon, there was no one left to bury the last people who died. Even the monasteries, hidden away in lonely valleys, were not spared. A single sick visitor seeking help could bring the plague inside the quiet stone walls. The monks who once sang prayers now died in silence, their gardens growing wild. In the countryside, whole villages were found months later with doors swinging open in the wind. Inside, tables were still set for meals that were never eaten, and candles had burned all the way down. A few survivors wandered through the empty lands, looking for signs of life. And though many people were lost, small acts of kindness remained. A shepherd might give milk to a hungry child, or a widow would share her seeds for planting with a neighbor. The land itself began to change. Without people to tend it, forests grew closer to the empty villages, and roads became overgrown with grass. But even in the quiet, there were signs of survival. At night, you might see a single lantern lit in a window, or see smoke rising from a chimney far away. Life had not disappeared completely. It had just gone quiet for a while, like embers glowing under ash. The countryside had crumbled, not with a loud noise, but with a quiet sigh, and the silence it left behind would last for many years. In times of peace, faith can be a quiet and simple thing. It lives in morning prayers, in the gentle sound of church bells, and in the comfort of shared beliefs. But when a great fear falls upon the world, faith changes. It becomes a loud and desperate question, a cry toward the sky, asking why this is happening. As the Black Death moved across the land, people crowded into their churches, searching for answers and for safety. They lit thousands of candles, their small flames flickering in the vast, cold stone buildings. They prayed to the saints, fasted until they were weak, and walked in silent processions through the streets, hoping to show their sorrow and earn mercy. But the sickness did not listen to prayers. It entered the churches just as it entered any other home. Priests who stood at the altar to give comfort one day were gone the next. Soon, the heavy church doors were closed and locked. The bells stopped ringing because there was no one left to ring them. The sacred places became silent. People tried to make sense of the horror. The most common belief was that the plague was a punishment from God. They said it was a divine anger sent to cleanse a world that had become filled with greed and pride. In city after city, groups of people known as flagellants appeared. They were men and women who marched in long, chanting lines, believing that if they suffered enough, God would forgive the world. They wore simple robes and carried heavy whips with leather straps, striking themselves again and again until blood stained the roads beneath their feet. Villagers would gather to watch them pass, some in awe, some in terror. But these processions of pain did not stop the sickness. In many towns, they only brought more fear and sometimes carried the plague with them. When prayers seemed to fail, many people turned to older, forgotten beliefs. It was a time of superstition. People wore charms around their necks or tied bags of sweet-smelling herbs to their belts. They painted strange symbols on their doors, hoping to ward off the evil they felt was in the air. Others looked to the sky for answers. Astrologers studied the stars and blamed the disaster on a strange alignment of the planets, warning that the heavens were angry. In the deepest parts of their fear, people also turned against one another. Suspicion grew like a weed. Travelers were driven out of towns, and beggars were beaten. In a terrible wave of blame, Jewish communities were accused of causing the plague by poisoning the wells. It was a cruel and untrue story, born of terror. Though these communities were suffering and dying just like everyone else, they were attacked. Thousands were killed, not by the sickness, but by the fear of their neighbors. Even kings and popes were helpless. Leaders gave orders for fasting and prayer, but their own courts and castles were not spared. In remote monasteries, monks sat in quiet rooms, writing down the names of the dead. With each name, they feared they were writing the final chapter of the world, wondering if anyone would be left to read it. And yet, even as the world seemed to break apart, small acts of kindness held it together. This became a different kind of faith. It was the faith of a mother holding her child and whispering a soft lullaby to soothe their fear. It was the faith of a priest, too sick to stand, who continued to pray for his people from his bed. It was the faith of a neighbor who left a small bowl of water on a doorstep where she knew someone was sick inside. These simple acts of caring for one another became the most important prayers of all. The plague tested every belief, but it could not erase the quiet hope that lived in people's hearts. The sickness had broken the great cities of the south, but its journey was not over. When the cold of winter faded and spring returned, the plague awoke and began to travel north. It moved through the high mountain passes of the Alps, following the merchants who were brave enough to travel. Like the melting snow, it trickled down into the heart of Europe. It came to the towns of Germany, with their tall, timbered houses. The story was the same as it had been everywhere else. A traveler would arrive with a fever. A market would fall silent. A church bell would begin to ring and not stop. The sickness then traveled along the wide Rhine River, carried from one town to the next on boats. Next, it reached the rich trading cities of the Low Countries, like Bruges and Ghent. These were cities built on rules and order, but the plague did not follow any rules. The wealthy merchants, who were once masters of their world, now locked their doors in fear. The canals grew still, and the great halls where they traded cloths stood empty. Money could not stop the sickness. Then the plague learned to cross the sea again. It did not need a great galley from the east. A small fishing boat or a barge carrying wool was enough. At first, it was just a rumor in a small port town, but soon the first graves were dug. The sickness moved inland through the green fields and gentle hills of the English countryside. It followed the stone roads to London. London was a crowded city with narrow, muddy streets, and the sickness spread quickly from house to house. The great River Thames, the city's heart, seemed to carry sorrow out to the sea. The churchyards filled up so fast that large, deep pits had to be dug outside the city walls. At night, carts would bring the dead to these pits to be buried without a final prayer. Even then, the sickness was not finished. It boarded ships sailing to the cold lands of the far north. It reached Ireland, Scotland, and the snowy lands of Scandinavia. The people there had heard stories, but they did not think a southern sickness could reach them. But it did. It showed them that no country was far enough away to be safe. The plague did not care about maps or kings. It saw the whole world as one land, and it meant to visit every single corner. It was not just people who were dying. The old way of life was dying too. The rules that had held the world together for hundreds of years began to break. The world felt like it had been turned upside down, and no one knew which way was right anymore. Kings sat in their great stone castles, but the sickness came inside anyway. A king could give an order, but the messenger might fall ill on the road. The knights who guarded the castle grew sick, just like the farmers in the fields. The plague showed that crowns and armor could not protect you. Everyone was a servant to the same great fear. Lords who owned vast lands found themselves with no one to plow the fields or harvest the grain. The crops rotted where they grew. The law began to disappear. In many towns, the guards and judges were gone. They had either died or run away with their families. Without anyone to keep order, the laws on paper meant nothing. A thief might steal bread, and there would be no one to stop him. But often, there was no one to steal from. Doors were left unlocked because there was nothing and no one to protect inside. Work stopped. The sound of hammers in the blacksmith shop fell silent. The weaver's loom stood still, with thread still in place. Ships full of goods were tied to the docks, but there was no one to unload them. The things people had once thought were so important, gold, spices, fine cloth, now seemed worthless. You could not eat gold, and fine cloth could not keep you safe from the sickness. People who had duties and jobs were forced to abandon them. A ferryman might leave his boat on the riverbank. A baker might let his ovens go cold. A mayor might leave his town without a leader. It was not always because they were selfish. It was because they had to choose between their duty and their family, and many chose their family. The world that had been built on everyone doing their part was now a world where everyone had to fend for themselves. In a world without answers, people searched desperately for a cure. With so much sickness everywhere, everyone looked for a healer who could help. But the healers of this time did not understand what they were fighting. They knew about fevers and broken bones, but this was something new and terrible. The doctors of the time had many strange ideas. Some believed the sickness came from bad air, a kind of poison fog that drifted from town to town. Others thought the human body had 4 humors that needed to be in balance, and that the plague had thrown them out of order. Their cures were often more dangerous than the sickness itself. They would try anything they could think of, out of desperation. Some doctors would use a sharp knife to cut open the painful black swellings on a person's skin, hoping to let the sickness out. Others would place leeches on the body to suck out what they called bad blood. They made strange potions from crushed herbs, ground up gems, and other things they hoped would have magic. But none of these things worked. The doctors, with all their books and theories, were helpless. But even these doctors were scared, and many of them also got sick and died. The truest healing in that time did not come from doctors' potions. It came from the quiet and brave care of ordinary people. It came from nuns in monasteries who refused to abandon the sick. It came from priests who stayed to offer final prayers. It came from family members who chose not to run away. Their kind of healing was much simpler. It was the touch of a cool, damp cloth on a hot forehead. It was offering a small sip of water to someone with a dry throat. It was holding a person's hand so they would not feel alone in their fear. It was singing a soft song to bring a moment of peace. These small acts of love could not cure the body, but they could comfort the soul. In a world full of pain, this kindness was the only real medicine to be found. The great sickness did not end all at once. There was no final day or celebration. It faded slowly and unevenly, like a mist lifting from the fields in the morning. Some years were calm, while others brought the fear back again. But even when it seemed to be gone, it left behind a deep mark on the world. When people stepped out of their homes, they found a world that felt different. The air was quieter, and the streets seemed wider because there were fewer people walking them. The houses felt larger because so many voices inside were missing. People began to plant again, fix their roofs, and sweep the dust away. It was not the same world, but it was their world, and they began to rebuild it. Some towns were never rebuilt, but the people who had lived there carried the memories and names with them to new homes. Children were born who had never known the plague. They grew up hearing stories from their parents and grandparents about the time the world went still. The church bells rang again, but their sound seemed softer now because the people listening had changed. Faith was not lost, but it was different, more personal and quiet. The world of work changed too. Because so many had died, the workers who remained were needed more than ever. For the first time, they could ask for better pay and better homes, and many were listened to. The old balance of power between the rich and the poor began to slowly shift. The idea of family also grew wider, as strangers helped raise children and friends shared homes to survive. People learned from their suffering. Cities were cleaned more often, and people began to understand how sickness could move from one person to another. Art and stories returned. Painters and writers created works that were filled with sadness, but also with hope for the future. People remembered what they had lost. They remembered how fast life could change, and how precious every voice was. Because of this, many tried to speak more kindly and share what they had. The plague had taken so much, but it could not take away the will to keep living, to keep planting, and to keep loving. That strength became the root of a new world, a world forever changed, but one still filled with light. And because someone always remained to tell the story, hope was never truly lost.